is the brand new V4 Arrma Granite, and this is every single upgrade I could find for it. We've got parts from M2C, Proline, RC all-wheel drive, Arrma, and a whole lot more. And there's enough different on this new V4 model that I'm not sure all of it's gonna fit. We're gonna find out together though. And of course, you know we're gonna be overpowering this beast. Before we do that, there's one thing I wanna find out. This Radiomaster MT12 was recently updated and supposedly now supports the SLT protocol that are in these trucks. Though I'm not sure that applies to these new 2-in-1 systems. Let's find out. In order to update the MT12 firmware, we just need to take the SD card out of it, connect this to our computer, go to the Radiomaster website, download the latest firmware for it, extract it, copy the files over to the SD card, put this SD card back in, and then fire it up. As you can see here, when we go to the module, now we have the option for SLT. And if we scroll down, we can see we now have V1-4 channel. This is the one that might work with this receiver. All right, with the transmitter in bind mode, let's see if this works. It looks like it did bind. Does it actually control it? Seems to. Let's take this out and make sure it works. All right, yeah, seems to control it just fine. I'm not having any problems with it. The latency feels good. Everything feels really good with it. Of course, we gotta try a quick jump. Oh yeah, she jumps. So yes, the Radiomaster MT12 is a viable alternative for controlling these all-in-one systems. The only real downside is I wasn't able to figure out how to adjust the dynamic stability control. I'm not saying there's no way to do it. Edge TX on the MT12 is incredibly powerful and I don't know everything about it. We did have an unfortunate casualty out there while I was bashing. I don't know if you noticed or not, but there was ice on the ground and I got a little overzealous off camera. Unfortunately, plastic and sub-freezing temperatures don't mix and I snapped off this body mount. Not sure quite what we're gonna do about this, but let's deal with it later. One of the major concerns with doing big upgrades is weight gain, and being that this thing is mostly plastic and we're gonna be adding a lot of metal to it, I was curious to see just how much weight gain this particular upgrade was going to cause. So before I started taking it apart, I went ahead and weighed it, and as you can see here, with the battery, it weighs 8 pounds, 8.6 ounces. We'll see how much that changes at the end. The first thing we're gonna be swapping out is this center differential. I personally haven't had any problems with the stock center diff, but this no-name Amazon upgrade was really calling my name. So let's get this stock one out of here and see how they compare. By the way, one thing I missed in the previous video is this piece no longer has a captive nut, it just threads right into plastic. It is a pretty good, secure feeling thread though. This stock differential is made with a die-cast aluminum housing. It's a really beautiful die casting, by the way. Very highly detailed and it looks really good. The upgraded one appears to be CNC machined aluminum, and whereas we have a sintered steel mod 0.8 gear on the stock one, we have a CNC machined mod 0.8 gear on the upgraded one. This one does look like it's been leaking, though the stock one also looked like it was leaking from the factory, and as you can see, since we started using it, it hasn't leaked anymore. This is pretty common for these differentials. They sometimes tend to leak in shipping, but then not leak when you're using them. The fluid in this diff feels pretty thin, plus I want to take a look inside, so let's pop this apart. Differential tuning is one of those things that's highly subjective, and what works for one person almost certainly isn't going to work for everybody else. It really just depends on the type of bashing you do. I like to do a lot of stunts and jumps, so really thick center differential fluid works well for me. By the way, this upgrade differential is heavily thread locked, and these stock screws are absolute trash, so be really careful when you take them out because it's very easy to strip them. This gasket does want to stick, so I'm just going to carefully run a razor blade underneath it because I don't have a replacement and I don't want to ruin it. And opening this up, yeah, this looks very similar to the stock center differential. These gears actually look identical. Kind of makes me wonder if they didn't get these gears from Arrma. As I said, I like to do stunts, so we're going to put some of this Traxxas 20 million fluid in here. This is more like a putty, and whereas this will very close to lock up this center differential, it'll still allow it to do its job. In bashing, the center differential's primary job is to protect the drivetrain, and it does this by physically decoupling the front and rear ends of the drivetrain. Really thick differential fluid obviously reduces that decoupling, but even a little bit of available movement will still protect your drivetrain components. I did want to replace these button head screws with socket head cap screws because these take a larger bit, which is a lot stronger. Unfortunately, the taller profile fouls on the inside of this case, but I did replace them with higher quality ones. We're going to be running the stock motor for now, but we are going to swap out the stock motor plate to this M2C one. There really isn't anything wrong with the stock motor plate, but the M2C unit is 7075 and doesn't have these relief cuts in it, which makes it a little bit heavier, but a lot stronger. And of course, that fits in there perfectly and looks great. And now we just need to get this mesh set, and we can get this buttoned up. Okay, well, it's back out, and that's because it gets jammed up when you put it in the housing. I suspect we have a bearing mount tolerance issue. Measuring the bearing mount to bearing mount here, we get 28.69 millimeters. Nice. And if we measure the stock one, we get 28.17. That's about a half a millimeter difference. And whereas that's not huge, it's certainly not nothing. I suspect, given that this gasket is about a half a millimeter, when they created this, they designed it and forgot to leave tolerance for that gasket. So unfortunately, this is going to have to go back. And this is going to go back in. This is definitely one of the risks you take when you upgrade. Obviously, if you buy something from someplace like M2C, it's a lot lower of a risk, but there are often a ton of really important tolerances on these parts, and all it takes is one mistake in design or machining, and the part just won't fit. And yeah, the stock one is nice and free, so we'll just stick with this one. The next upgrade is going to be on these front and rear differentials, which I'm not 100% certain is going to work either, so let's dig in. Since these trucks already come with steel pinion gears on the new differentials, we're going to try to just swap out the ring gear, and to go along with that, we also have to swap out the housing. Assuming this works, it'll save us quite a bit of money over swapping out the entire differential. If you've never taken one of these axle shafts off, the screw for it's way down here in the middle, which is where these included bits come in really handy. The bits I normally use aren't actually long enough to do this. All right, pull this yoke apart, and we can see that stock steel pinion gear. Lining that up with the new ring gear, it looks like it probably is going to mesh properly, so let's give it a try. If you're not familiar with these differentials, you might be wondering why we have to take all of this apart just to replace the ring gear, and that's because on these plastic diffs, the ring gear is actually part of the housing, so we have to replace the entire housing. And of course, that means we have to strip everything out of this one. I've been asked before what kind of pliers these are. These are Knipex pliers wrench. These are their smallest version. They're model number 8603125. These are not cheap tools, but they are excellent tools, and I recommend getting a pair, especially these little ones, and just see how you like them. Of course, we're not going to be throwing away this old differential. We're going to put it in a Ziploc baggie so it doesn't make a mess, and keep it as a spare part. And now we just need to load up the new one. I believe these come with 10K from the factory. I don't have any 10K, so 20K should be fine. Be careful not to get too much fluid down in this center hole. A pin from the other side goes in there. If you put too much fluid in there, it's not going to go together properly. And now we just need to close this up and pop our new steel ring gear on. All right, moment of truth. Will these two gears properly mesh with each other? And the answer is, yeah, they seem like they will. Awesome. Doing it this way will definitely save you quite a bit of money over buying the full steel differentials that are already assembled. I've had a few people ask me why they don't really see me put grease on gears, and the reason is that most of the time the grease that's already on the gears that are left over, or a little bit of grease I see that's down in here I can just wipe on the gear, is plenty. The thing about gear lubrication is that the actual amount of lubricant you're using is microscopic, and the vast majority of grease you put on gears just gets slung off as wasted and makes a mess. Just the merest whiff of grease on the teeth is plenty. To go along with that new differential, we've got two choices of CVDs. We've got these factory Arrma upgrades, and we've got some all steel ones from RC all-wheel drive. Let's put the RC all-wheel drive ones in the back and the Arrma ones in the front. That way we can compare and contrast them and see if there's any difference. I have used these RC all-wheel drive ones previously, and whereas they don't get the best reviews in the world, I've never had any problems with them. The biggest complaint I've seen is these grub screws that hold them on backing off. In order to make sure that doesn't happen, clean these grub screws with alcohol first. As you can see, there's quite a bit of oil from manufacturing still in there. And then just make sure you use plenty of thread locker. Also make sure that you let this thread locker cure for 24 hours. If you don't, it might fail. Also make sure you actually tighten the grub screw against this flat in the spline section of the differential output. If you tighten it up on one of these other splines, it might still work, but it might also come out on you. Now let's just get this buttoned up, and then we've got some really sexy shocks to install. Before we put the new shocks on, we need to fix this rear shock tower. There are pieces missing from this. Like I said, it's shattered from being out there in way too cold a temperature, but fortunately I think we can just screw this to the shock tower temporarily, and hopefully that'll hold it. There we go. Let's drill the other three. There we go, just like factory, but now the question is, will the body still fit on? Moment of truth. And it does. Is that gonna hold up to serious bashing? I'm not sure, but if not, we've always got tape. And now it's time to install these beautiful Proline rear shocks. These shocks aren't cheap, but they definitely are nice. These shocks use what are known as progressive rate springs. We've actually got two springs here, a stronger one and a weaker one. And as it collapses, the spring rate is the average of both springs, but then the weaker spring bottoms out, and then you're just using the spring rate of the stronger spring, which means you get both better light bump handling and better jump landing handling in the same package. These Prolines are also emulsion style shocks, which means they don't have a bladder in them. Instead, they just have an O-ring seal. A lot of bashers are going to emulsion style shocks, including the latest V6 Arrmas and EXB V2. And in my experience, the emulsion style shock actually handles jump landing better. I think this is because you don't have that bladder in there, which is creating an extra air spring inside the shock, and that helps control rebound better. Just gonna bleed most of the air out of here. This is a basher shock, so I'm not that worried about it, but it is nice to get most of it out. And there's a little hole in the side of this shock cap, so we just put this shock cap most of the way on, collapse the shock, and then finish tightening it. Obviously, this would be easier if you took the springs off the shock, but if you want to be lazy like me, you can do it this way, and that feels really nice. Let me do the other one, and let's get these on the truck. There we go, guys. The back end is done, and this thing's looking absolutely awesome. I'm going to do the exact same thing to the front end, then we've got just a few more things to check out before we get to the electronics. And now that's done too and looking great. As you can see, we used the Arrma CVDs. Those Proline shocks look awesome, and now we've just got a few more pieces to put on here. I want to use my favorite Proline Badlands tires, but these have 17mm hexes on them, so we're going to need to use these 17mm adapters from M2C. Not only are those adapters going to allow us to run the 17mm hexes, but they make the truck a little bit wider, which should make it a bit more stable. These are really easy to put on. You just take the stock hex off, put these on the stub axle, add a generous amount of thread locker to this nut, and screw it on, then tighten it up. As you can see, compared to the stock wheel hex, this is going to give us quite a bit of extra width. I'm definitely curious to see how the stock electronics are going to handle a bit of extra weight. We are going to be going with 4S, but I want to try it with 3S first just to see how it'll handle it for people that don't want to upgrade their electronics. Those upgrades are going to include this Servo, but we've got some testing we need to do on this first, so stay tuned. That's going to be fun. Now it's time to install the most beautiful and heaviest upgrade on this truck, this brand new M2C chassis brace. This brace is compatible with both the new V4 Vortex and this V4 Granite, and has a different shape underneath to accommodate the reinforced chassis. Opposed to just leaving these holes open, M2C has provided these nice spacers which fill those up and give a better mounting point for the brace. And now we just need to pop on the brace and install the longer included screws. That fits perfectly and even includes an extra little front skid plate. All right, let me get these stock electronics reinstalled, and then let's see how much this thing weighs with these upgrades. While I'm doing this, put your guess down in the comments how much more you think this truck's gonna weigh. It weighed 8 pounds, 8.6 ounces before, so how much do you think it weighs now? Okay guys, got your guesses locked in. Moment of truth, it now weighs 9 pounds, 6 ounces. That's only about a 10% weight gain, and that's not bad for everything we upgraded on this truck. All right, let's see how those upgrades handle. But before we go out, there's one more thing I need to do, and that's trim this body. I'm not sure why, but stock, this body rubs the tires really badly in turns. This seems like kind of a strange thing for Arrma to miss, but it should be a pretty easy fix. There we go. That doesn't even look that bad. Let's go bash. Guys, this thing is an absolute blast, but now it's time to swap in some serious power. Before we do that, we've got some testing to do on this servo. This Savox 0231MG purports to be IP67 waterproof, and in a previous video, we dunked another Savox waterproof servo in water, but we didn't do it with the servo moving. This time, we're gonna do it again, but we're gonna do it and make sure the servo's in motion the whole time. First thing we need to do is grab a glass, put some dirt in it, put some water in it, pop a servo horn on our poor test subject, hook it up to our servo tester, and then dunk this in the water. water. We'll come back to this in a little bit. While that's marinating, let's add some more power to this truck. As you can see, this reinforcement skid plate definitely did its job. Not only does it have a bunch of scratches on it, but there's a big dent here in the front of it. That likely saved this plastic from getting damaged pretty badly on what was obviously a fairly serious hit. Because of the 2-in-1 nature of this ESC receiver, we're gonna have to add another receiver when we replace it. Fortunately, these V4 vehicles do still come with the standard waterproof receiver box, so you're able to put your receiver in here without having to buy anything other than the receiver itself. In the comments of a previous video, I got a bunch of really good suggestions for what to replace this stock servo saver with. This servo saver isn't the best in the world. There are really great options such as using a crawler servo saver from Triel, though you do have to space up your servo in order to do that. But I decided to go with this hot racing one. I saw mixed reviews on it, and I'm curious to see how it's going to work out. In order to find out though, we're going to have to go retrieve our test subject. And this poor thing's been stirring the forbidden milkshake for about 20 minutes now. Let's get it out of here and see if it survived. Being IP67 rated, this should have held up just fine, but I've seen other servos that were IP67 rated and didn't really look like they were that waterproof. So interestingly here, we don't see any O-ring on these screws. That's not the end of the world, as the screws themselves can do some sealing, though with this being IP67 rated, I'm kind of surprised to see that. Maybe they have it designed internally so that's not necessary. I will say these screws definitely seem a lot more stout than most screws I take out of servos. Usually they're pretty spindly. All right, let's pop this bottom cover off. And okay, now I think we can see why we didn't have O-rings on those screws. The screws themselves actually don't go into the compartment where the electronics are. So if this area gets wet, it doesn't matter. Of course, it doesn't seem like it got wet anyway. We do have a nice O-ring here in the bottom, and that appears to have sealed everything out. You can see the brushed motor here and its attached circuit board are completely dry. And then popping the top, we have another O-ring, and inside here, it looks like this is also completely dry. It looks like our first and second gears are brass, and then we've got black steel gears going out from there. And then here's the real reason why this thing is truly IP67 waterproof. If you look down in there, that's actually a lip seal, not an O-ring. And that's what you really need to seal a moving part like this output shaft. An O-ring is probably okay, but it's not going to be nearly as good as this lip seal. And that's why this thing can handle being in dirty water for 20 or 30 minutes without having any problems. Now let's get this thing put back together and get it in the truck. One really nice thing is that Arrma actually gives you a diagram for how to center your servo. One really annoying thing is that Hot Racing gives you 3 different adapters for this servo saver, and they don't really tell you which one's the 25 spline. There are little letters on here, and it turns out those little letters actually correspond to different servo brands, and I'm pretty sure the one you want is the one with the F on it, because that's a 25 tooth Futaba style, but it'd be nice if they just put the numbers on there, because these all fit on really tightly, and it's kind of hard to know if you have the right one or not. To center it, we're going to use this little toolkit M6000. It allows you to set a PWM value, which is pulse width modulation. Basically, that just means the difference between how long the signal is on and how long it's off. Typically, servos expect signals between 1 and 2 milliseconds, which means centered is 1.5 milliseconds or 1500 microseconds as they're showing here. That should have this servo centered. Of course, you could just hook this up to a receiver and center it with your transmitter as well. And now we just need to get this as close to centered as possible. I can definitely see how this adapter could be problematic for some people. It really doesn't fit super positively, and I'm actually going to have to use the screw to draw the servo saver down the rest of the way. If you got that adapter crossed up in there, or maybe even use the wrong one, it could probably strip out pretty easily. We'll just have to see how this one holds up when we test it. And we might as well add the included aluminum steering link. The last thing we need to do is install our ESC, and this is going to be the easiest way to get 4S on one of these trucks. This is the SPMX SE1120. It's a 120 amp Firma ESC, and it actually bolts right onto the stock mount. When you're putting wiring in one of these receiver boxes that has the side seal, the easiest way to do it is to pull the side seal almost all the way up out of there. Then you can take your wires, put them in the seal, and then just push the seal down with the wires in. If you try to push the wires into the seal with it all the way down in there already, you're probably just going to end up mashing the seal down into the box. Not only does the ESC mount right up, but the switch does too. There we go. Let's get her in the truck. The nice thing about using this ESC is that the motor is going to connect right up. Of course, I did forget we no longer have a connector for the motor fan, so I'm gonna have to wire that back up into the box. That's not a big deal though. She's all wired up. Let's go see how this thing handles some serious 4S power. Guys, I think you'll agree this thing is wild on 4S. The drivetrain did hold up well, though unfortunately our body repair didn't. That's not really the fault of the truck though. I really like these Proline shocks. The upgraded Arrma CVDs, as well as these RC all-wheel drive CVDs, held up just fine. This 4S ESC has plenty of power and is really easy to upgrade. The center differential helps protect things, and this heatsink and fan kept this motor reasonably cool even when bashing on 4S, though it isn't really that hot out right now, so it might get a little bit warmer in the summer, though you could always just upgrade this fan as well. Overall, I'm really happy with this V4 Granite. It is a perfect combination of bashability and portability. I'm really glad you joined me for this upgrade. Join me in one of these videos.